welcome. This is the second day of the conference, Leadership Leadership in the 21st Century. The subject of today is precisely academia, integrating research into policymaking and implementation. So it's 1 hour session, the first one of day 2. Every day is a new beginning, and we have a fantastic panel with us, headed by Emil Constantinescu, who is going to be chairing and moderating the session. Also with us are Michael Møller, Piero Dominici, Afshan Khan, Moller, and Peter Mcgrath, that will be introduced by our chair, Emil. So I see that they are all with us. Let me say a few words as Vice President of the World Academy about Emil Constantinescu, for those who don't know him. He is obviously a scholar. He is also a legendary figure for many of us. He is the man who promoted freedom, he promoted democracy in Romania. And this is why he is well known. He was elected as president of Romania, directly elected in 1996 for a 4-year term. And during his presidency, Romania engaged in a large process of reforms that entailed reforms in economy, justice, and administration. During that time, Romania also joined the EU and NATO. Later, Emil resumed his academic career and made further steps to consolidate non-governmental organizations in his own country. And he launched, inter alia, the 21st European Generation Forum and founded the Romanian Academic Forum. Not only in Romania, Emil was also active worldwide. Among other achievements, he supervised the parliamentary elections in Senegal and Tunisia, 2001 and 2011. So without further ado, I give the floor to Emil, that in turn will introduce his eminent speakers. Good morning, Emil. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Thank you, Donato, for this kind of presentation. Esteemed guests, it is a pleasure to welcome you today to the panel of an integrated approach to research, policy making, and implementation, with a specific emphasis of the academic milieu. I am particularly glad to be discussing these issues in my double quality as a scholar with a lengthy experience in natural and humanistic sciences and assessment. I am currently running the Institute for Advanced Study in Levant Culture Civilization, which is also a center of excellence of World Academy of Art of Science. I'm glad to have with us today several people who have devoted their life and activity to policy making in several fields of development, who have traveled and worked in remote areas of the globe in a desperate need of assistance and counseling. I am glad to moderate a panel in which we can discuss directly with personalities and scholars involved in the drawing policies for the United Nations programs, UNICEF, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the InterAcademy Partnership, and several other organizations. This session examines an integrated multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, and multilateral political, social, intellectual strategy to bridge the prevailing gaps between academic research, public policy, business, and civil society, between piecemeal, fragmented sectorial approaches, and between uncoordinated national initiatives. It aims to improve the speed, contextual relevance, quality, coordination, integration, and overall effectiveness of human security policies, strategies, programs, implementation, and assessment. It includes governments, international organizations, academies, universities, research institute, business and civil society organizations. The goal is to formulate, disseminate, and generate support for more effective and timely efforts to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In that regard, I would like to propose to all the speakers the following questions for discussion. First, what role can the United Nations system play in fostering closer coordination and integration between disciplines and stages of project, from research and policy making to implementation? Second, what would be the anticipated benefits of new institution models which foster closer integration and coordination as discussed in this panel? Third, what example exists of project development models which successfully bridge the gaps between research, policy making, implementation, and social involvement? And finally, fourth, what type of partnership can be forged with national academies and research institutes to bridge the gap between research and practical implementation? I wish a warm welcome to our panelists, and I would like to present them to you as take the floor. Since we have a limited time frame for this panel, I propose 5 minutes for each panelist in order to have time for the conclusions. To begin with the ladies, Mrs. Afshan Khan is a UNICEF Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia and the Special Coordinator for the Refugee and Migrant Response in Europe. She has been an international public servant for over 30 years, working as a Director of Emergency Program for UNICEF, Associate Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the UNICEF representative in Jamaica. Mrs. Khan has extensive field experience, including assignment in Kenya, Mozambique, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Colombia. From 2012 to 2014, Mrs. Khan became the CEO of Women for Women International. In this role, she was responsible for setting the strategic vision and mobilizing the necessary resources for women rebuilding their life after war. Welcome, Mrs. Khan, and you have now you now have the floor to share with us your ideas.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and distinguished colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. Let me start, I think, perhaps by answering the first question, that data, research, and evaluation is an important pillar for the leadership we need to renew multilateralism. And I think integrating into policy making and implementation to support leadership, all of research and evidence is an integral part of what we do at UNICEF. We support and draw on sound evidence to respond to the needs of children in order to determine what works best for children. It's part of making especially the most vulnerable children visible, and it's also an integral part of our advocacy with government. I'd like to focus a little bit on how our work on research has influenced policy making and implementation in support to the 2030 Agenda commitments towards social inclusion, environmental protection, sustainable economic growth. Yearly, we've taken an award on research and evaluation as a recognition of supporting governments to enshrine domestic law and the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the child into work that looks at what are the needs of children. I'll start by a few practical examples with how this has helped shape the agenda going forward. I would say first and foremost, what's been on a lot of people's minds right now is the whole issue of children and digital safety, largely because so much has gone online. Since 2016, the Global Kids Online Network, of which UNICEF is part, and it is a network of academic researchers and others, has been one of the most comprehensive studies on children and parents' engagement with digital technology worldwide. And the Global Kids Online has been shaping policy on internet governance and advocacy for child protection issues to make sure that issues around internet exposure are addressed. The 2015 1 and 3 report influenced the Global Commission on Internet Governance to consider the particular rights and needs of internet users under 18 in their processes and policies for the first time in 25 years. This has already had influence at the country level, for example, in governments such as Albania, Argentina, and Brazil, who have redone their policies as a result of this research and evidence. If I go to my own region on education, one example is research commissioned by UNICEF in partnership with the Ministry of Public Education to assess learning levels among children at the end of primary school in order to understand background factors that may increase these learning levels or influence them. The set of studies was a benchmark for achieving learning outcomes. The ministry already implemented key recommendations by introducing early grade reading and mathematics assessment with the support of several donor governments. The research has also informed the development of a new curriculum framework for Uzbekistan and integrated a process of curriculum revisions for grades 1 through 11. So in this way, we've seen how research and evidence has influenced project development models. Violence against children is another issue where we've seen in some countries, Brazil as an example, where a daily toll of adolescent homicides rose sixfold between 1980 and 2014. So here UNICEF worked together with the Legislative Assembly, the government and state of Ceará in order to improve support for young people who are vulnerable to crime and violence. The result was an establishment of a special commitment on the prevention of adolescent homicides with an initial investment by government of close to $1 million for prevention programs, and other states are copying this initiative. The reason I'm bringing to the fore some of the practical implications of research is that we often use research to improve and accelerate programming. And that's a critical element of not only improving what type of development assistance models are provided, it's also a way in which we can engage with academia, with civil society, and others to communicate and influence agendas with respect to children. We see this as a critical element of building networks and influence. And in a time when facts and evidence, research, and data are more important than ever before, we do see these investments as critical to really changing the way in which governments work and in the way in which new issue areas are addressed. So I'll take one issue area that's been critical during the period of COVID, but also I would say as a result of several years of evidence. In the past 8 years, UNICEF has increasingly connected more evidence on mental health of adolescents. For instance, research identifies that early diagnosis, meaning before the age of 11, can have a significant impact in lowering mental health problems in adolescents in later years. Working with governments, other studies have examined the effectiveness of mental health services, for example, in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Belarus. So through our Innocenti Research Center based in Florence, we've brought together a conference around leading minds to think practitioners, key stakeholders and others to rethink what does the new type of model of engagement around mental health need to look like for the future. So we address this challenge in a very clear and real way in a multi-stakeholder environment. The COVID-19 pandemic has also made the need for accurate research, data, and analysis even more urgent. And UNICEF has responded to this as well. For example, we just recently launched, day before yesterday, a study looking at child poverty rates across high-income countries and what they will look like beyond the pre-COVID-19 levels for the next 5 years. And recognize that over 2% of public financial relief in these countries was allocated to support children and families during the first wave of the pandemic, while around 90% was allocated to business interests. Therefore, we've been engaging very heavily with governments, with the European Union, on a universal basic income to support families as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So colleagues, just to say, we see that the demand for research is growing, especially those that aim for practical recommendations, that complex issues affecting vulnerable populations can be addressed with required ethical considerations, for which we've developed guidelines and protocols, and empirical evidence generation and data and rigorous research and thoughtful analysis can allow decision makers to understand the situation of children and youth and what stands in the way of their full development. This core strategy remains a key priority for our work in the organization and our work with member states to contribute to the achievement of SDGs. And we see the network of institutions that are available at the UN and outside to support these initiatives as a critical pillar of that agenda. So thank you.
Correlating today's issues of discussion with the work you perform with the UNICEF and this impact of multilateralism and development. The examples you gave speak volumes on what has been done and still needs to be done in the countries you mentioned. Indeed, we need to join effort in creating the network you refer to, as they are essential in approaching children relating aspects from multiple perspectives, especially in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We move now to our second panelist, Michael Møller, chair of the Diplomacy Forum and a member of the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator Foundation. Michael Møller has over 40 years of experience as an international civil servant in the United Nations system, working as a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva. He was also the Secretary General of the Conference of Disarmament, while beginning his career as a program officer and legal officer with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. After the UNHCR, Mr. Møller went on to hold various roles within the United Nations system in Iran, Mexico, Haiti, Cyprus, New York, and Geneva. It is noteworthy that since the General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on 25 September 2015, Michael Møller has promoted Geneva as an operational hub of the global goals. Also, Mr. Møller established in December 2016 the SDG Lab, a unit within his office to support the range of stakeholders in Geneva, working to advance the 2030 Agenda by further leveraging their expertise and knowledge into policy, practice, and action. He is also a supporter of gender equality, an aspect uniting most of our panelists. As in 2015, he contributed actively to the launch of the International Geneva Gender Champions, a leadership network committed to accomplishing meaningful change in the pursuit of gender equality. Welcome, Mr. Møller. I invite you to take the floor as we look forward to your opinions.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for a very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to take part in this conversation, which the subject of which is very close to my heart and to many of the things that I do and certainly do still. And I will speak a little bit about that now. Clearly, it's also a pleasure to be in the company of so many of you, which kind of obviates the need that to start talking about the need for better multilateralism, for better collaboration and integration of our efforts, because we're all sort of champions of that and all very much working on that. Also, it's clear that to all of us, the way that the current pandemic has accelerated some of these needs, urgent needs, as both the evidence of what happens when there is a almost criminal lack of coordination and cooperation in terms of the impact on the ground and the impact of people. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit and explain to you what I'm doing now, and particularly what GESDA is doing, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, because the way it's set up, its objectives, its outcomes and its structure actually answers practically all four of the questions that you posed at the beginning, Mr. Chairman. And so let me start by very briefly explaining what it is. It's a foundation that was created by the Swiss government together with the governments of Geneva and the city of Geneva to scan, on the one hand, to scan the cutting edge science that is coming up in the future, what is bubbling, if you want, in the laboratories right now across the world, to harness that knowledge and ask the scientists who are working on it to sit down with what will be the end users of those technologies and those sciences that are being developed. Particularly, we call it the diplomacy, but it's a broad concept where we are looking and talking to and incorporating actors in the development world, in the humanitarian world, in the human rights world, in the health world, all of our colleagues across the world that have a role in implementing not just their projects, but certainly also making sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are being used as a roadmap for getting to do that. Putting together those two communities, which don't speak to each other very often and who have different languages, is part of our sort of main objective. And I'll go a little bit more into depth now to explain how we're going to and why we're doing it. So anticipating which frontier science and technologies are emerging and which global challenges these scientific breakthroughs may then tackle, I think is very much a prerequisite to better serve humanity today. And doing so is not obvious in our highly global, specialized and compartmentalized world as science and technology is accelerating. GESDA's purpose is to achieve this by bringing together actors, as I just said, from the science society, diplomacy, governmental and intergovernmental organizations, industry and philanthropy. So what we're set up to do is to anticipate the science that is coming and the possible use of cutting-edge science for inclusive development for all throughout the world, relying on effective scouting of what is cooking in the labs that can impact us positively and beneficially over the next 5, 10, and 25 years. Now that is our time frame. The sort of operational word in our title is anticipation, and that's very much what we're trying to do. We're not looking at what's happening today, and lots of other people are doing that. Once we've done that, we are then, our role is going to be to accelerate the development of inclusive solutions to tackle the emerging challenges that people, society, and the planet are facing by mobilizing creative coalitions. And finally, to translate those solutions into sustainable projects, to be implemented within the communities around the world, with early contributions of various actors from different professional origins and mindsets. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Just some of the objectives that are wrapped into that is, of course, the implementation of the SDGs, and very much the basic principle that we're working on is leaving no one behind. We are very keen and very aware of the need to make sure that whatever we do is has an ethical red thread. We don't want to be helping to create Frankensteins. We want to make sure that what we do is for the good of humanity, not for the bad. That the human rights is a red thread throughout what we do as well. The human right to access to science is very much part of our foundation. And of course, to answer your first question, as we move into the operational phase more and more, our main and sort of central partners is the UN system as a whole, the United Nations, who by definition are going to be many of those end users of what we are coming up with. So the outcomes is to help the world benefit faster from the advances of science and technology, and to contribute to inclusive development by reducing poverty and inequality and encouraging the development of emerging economies. And I think a sort of a secondary but equally important objective is, through what we're doing, and if we manage to do it well, to prove a very simple proposition that working together is better than not, and to give a proof of concept of a new kind of multilateralism and a new kind of multilateral approach to the way that we work together. So in order to do all that, we have given ourselves three fundamental questions, three filters, if you want, that kind of help us decide on which way we're going, which kind of sciences, etc. And the first question is, who are we? What does it mean to be human in the era of robots, gene editing, and augmented reality? The second question is, how will we be living together in the future? Which deployment of technology can help reduce inequality and foster inclusive development and well-being? And third, how can we ensure humankind's well-being with the sustainable health of our planet? How can we help supply the world population with the necessary food and energy and still regenerate our planet? So these are the basics. We have decided, based on this, to focus to start with on four thematic platforms. And the four are quantum revolution and advanced artificial intelligence. The second one is augmented human. So under the first, we're looking at next generation digitalization, certainly on the challenges of privacy and superintelligence. On the second one, we are looking at the challenges of germline gene editing or neural enhancements. These are examples. I'll come, if we have time, I'll give you some more detailed examples of what we have been working already. The third one is the eco-generation and geoengineering, the challenges of using synthetic biology to address environmental problems, decarbonization or agricultural needs, and the efficient use of global resources. And the fourth is science and diplomacy, challenges such as conflict modeling, forecasting and prevention, access to science as a human right, and the future of international law to develop a multilateralism adapted to the 21st century and the geopolitical evolutions we're living under. The foundation is, as I said, a Swiss foundation and founded in 2019. We are still in the startup phase. We have just been in action for a year. We are now at the stage where the scientists that we have brought in, about 65 of them from all over the world, have been working very diligently and very hard. These are top-notch scientists that have now delivered what we call 12 scientific briefs within those four platforms. And I'll do very quickly just give you the headlines that will give you a feel and a taste of the things that we're going to be moving forwards. We're not going to move on all of them, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So Within the platform one, which is quantum revolution and the advanced artificial intelligence, we're looking at from context-driven and higher order reasoning artificial intelligence to artificial general intelligence. We're looking at large-scale quantum networks for secure quantum computations. And under platform two, we're looking at cognitive engineering and memory enhancements. And remember, these are all being looked at in the time frame 5, 10 to 25 years. Then we are going to look at genomic, or have looked at genomic medicine, chimeras, and human genetic resource management. Under platform three, the eco-regeneration and geoengineering, we look at decarbonizing the industry and negative emissions technologies, at eco-regeneration, including space and oceans, resources, and synthetic life. Platform four, we are looking at anticipating the third globalization, the future of work, inclusive developments. We're looking at the future of global governance and multilateralism. We're looking at social augmentation, and we are looking also at the values and behaviors and futures literacy. So this is what the scientists have been working on until now, and this is going to be the subject of a first discussion that we're going to have the day after tomorrow, with the counterparts, with the ones we have kind of baptized the diplomacy moderators, which is a group that we have put together of very senior people, including heads of agencies, UN agencies, former politicians, prime ministers, science advisors, artists, philosophers, social scientists, etc. And these people are coming together on Friday to discuss, for the first time to meet and to start to discuss these issues that I've just mentioned on the basis of the papers that have been prepared, and to come up with an agreement on which of these and give priorities on which of these are the most adapted to provide the tools that our colleagues who are out in the field trying to make life better for people can use to make their life easier. Once that has happened, and hopefully we'll come to an agreement on maybe 3 or 4 out of the 10 papers that we're presenting to them, this will be given to our board at the end of January, and they will decide on the final 2 papers on which they will then ask us to move ahead. We move ahead into a situation room where we have come up with a new way of a new process, if you want, given the multiplicity of actors and the very different actors with different languages, different impact in points, where we accompany all of these people, bringing in philosophers, bringing in ethicists, bringing in human rights activists, etc., to make sure, and also bring in the public at the end of the day, that we are going to have the kind of solutions that everybody has bought into. I can speak for a lot longer on this. I think I've taken up my time, and I know there are several other speakers, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Møller, for your input on the need to bring together all actors of society, with a particular emphasis on those coming from the field of science and technology. As you mentioned, we need inclusive solutions and projects that can tackle multiple issues within the global society. I appreciate especially the red thread you build between human rights and sciences, and I congratulate you for creating those 4 thematic platforms. And we all look forward to seeing the results given the Friday meeting you just mentioned. Our third panelist is Professor Piero Dominici, a fellow of the Old Academy of Art of Science, with a PhD in social theory and research from the Sapienza University of Rome. He teaches psychology of social complexity and intelligence networks and complex systems at the University of Perugia, where he is a scientific director of the Complexity Education Project. A scientific researcher, educator, author, and international speaker, his main areas of expertise and interest encompass hypercomplexity, interconnectivity, interdisciplinarity, and knowledge sharing in the fields of education, system theory, technology, innovation, intelligence, security, citizenship, and communication. Welcome, Professor Dominici. We are glad to have you with us today. As I understood that you have been recovering from COVID-19. I hope you
Yes.
are feeling better, and we thank you for the effort made with the oxygen mask on to still participate. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, President Constantinescu? Thank you very much. I'm very honored. It's a good pleasure for me. I'll try to go fast. I'd like to share a lot of ideas by my scientific interest for this important project. Now I try to fast. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me thank the whole organization of the United Nations, the General Direction, the Geneva office, the World Academy of Art and Science, and in particular, my WAS president, a true friend and brother. He has been very close to me, even in these difficult weeks. Gary is a special person. Just a few words to greet everyone participating in this inspirational event. I'd like to say how lucky I feel to be able to share this experience with those of you I already know and those I'm meeting for the first time today, with all United Nations participants from around the world, and with my colleague from the World Academy of Art and Science, of which I'm truly proud to be a fellow. I feel doubly fortunate to be here with you today, as I am speaking from a hospital ward, as you can see, where I'm recovering from a bad bout of COVID. All in, this is an extremely moving moment for me. So I hope the connection will be from here. Now I try to go fast. First of all, the strategic relevance and importance of a new global leadership for 21st century, new leadership for peace, new sustainable development and human rights, leadership for a renewal multilateralism, in my opinion, force us to radically rethink the quality of the educational and training processes, of the organization and cultural processes that distinguish, identifies our schools and university. We need global leadership with a systemic vision and approach. So we need to educate to see object as system and not vice versa. And we need to rethink radically research in a real transdisciplinary approach. That is the problem. That is the problem, to create the complex conditions that are social and cultural, to recompose, to heal some historical traditional fractures in the complex architectures of our knowledge and skills that condemn us to a global condition of cultural delay, also in our relationship with the technological and digital transformation, which is above all an anthropological transformation. We need to modify our organizational culture and models, especially those that regards the schools and university. At the moment, in several countries, they are closed systems. We need to rethink our organizational institutions as open, complex systems and not as machines. That is the fundamental confusion that we are continuing to reproduce also in our academies. The confusion between complex systems that are unpredictable and complicated systems that are predictable and manageable. Speaking of future generation, according to the World Economic Forum, 65% of the children currently in elementary school will have jobs in the future which not only do not yet exist, but which cannot even imagine, considering how fast work is changing our world today. In this day, in which skills and knowledge become obsolete in the blink of an eye, what can young people train for? The deepest and most significant reflection to make of this question is that young people should first and foremost seek, discover, and live out their desires. Educators, students, managers, and experts alike need to find the courage to go beyond the deceptive vision that pushes us to always look for something useful in what we do, even regarding our personal growth and intellectual maturation. This passion, in fact, must be discovered, stimulated, awakened, encouraged, and brought out through a complex educational pathways that should begin during the first years of school, a pathways capable of holding together reason and imagination, thought and emotions, which are too often removed from the educational and formative itineraries. We need to stake our bets on those formative pathways designed for an increasingly interdependent and multidisciplinary outlook, which will enable us to leave behind the age-old logic of separation and what I call the false dichotomies, including, as you know, the well-known concept of the two cultures, humanities and sciences. What we consider today to be the limits of the field of knowledge, to be the borders between knowledge and skills, between rationality and creativity, can and must become openings, passageways, pathways, opportunities, because it is the complexity of the ongoing change, its ambivalence, velocity, and unpredictability, a complexity that's increasingly marked by the coexistence of order and chaos that has shown us in no uncertain terms the inadequacy of current educational formative processes, as well the inconsistency of reductionist explanation and of the traditional linear interpretive model. These are profound criticalities and anomalies, which alongside our ontological incompleteness have accelerated the obsolescence of knowledge and skills even more sharply. Today, the social and cultural future belongs to those who will succeed in healing the fracture between the human and the technological, to those who will succeed in redefining and rethinking the complex relationships between the natural and the artificial, to those who will manage to bring knowledge and skills together, not to separate them, to those who will, furthermore, know how to unite and merge the two cultures, both in terms of education and formative training, and define profiles and professional competence. In this sense, this urgency that can be felt to leave behind what I call the false dichotomies, theory versus practice research, knowledge versus competences, hard skills versus soft skills, art versus science, touch versus action, creativity versus rationality, specialization versus interdisciplinarity. The traditional borders between studies in the scientific fields and the humanities have in fact been completely done away with, owing to the extraordinary scientific discoveries and the continual acceleration brought about by the technological innovation, which renders even more unavoidable the urgency of an education that teach complexity and critical thinking. Taking special care with regard to topics concerning school and university to resist to the continuous temptation, the shortcuts, the easy solution, the reassuringly well-beaten paths that often conceal mere vested interest in power or in economic factors, the ideological views which incessant promotion and in marketing have done so much to render visible, acceptable, and approvable. First of all, however, it is necessary to teach analytical and critical thinking to people, enabling to use their own heads and to question themselves and others around them, instead of simply accepting the standard answer solution and to see object as system. So in my opinion, the problem is also simplification, opportunity or risk. Along with this, The not so new ideology of simplification, supported by the ongoing technological transformation, which sees simplification as an absolute value. But here we need to ask ourselves, should simplification be considered opportunity or risk? To answer this, it is necessary to understand that simplification is not an end, but merely a means. As an end, simplification is something that is imposed by trampling on any person or social or cultural factor that stands in its way. Simplification applied as a means, on the other hand, can have both positive or negative implication. Both language, for example, and communication, of course, intimately linked to the education. In educational fields, simplification is above all negative. You can take to the reductionism to education to only a problem of digital education. There is in our education institution a negative tendency to reduce learning to mastering processes and know-how skills, and to believe that teaching technology, in particular digital technology, is a quick fix to our current educational crisis. By doing so, we are perpetrating the great mistake of our technological civilization, to think that for this kind of civilization, we need only technicians. It's time to realize that we can just continue to run after and to adapt to the ongoing technological and digital transformation, ignoring their ethical and epistemological implication and underestimating how deeply digital technology has changed our perception and understanding of reality. So, in conclusion, on the contrary, it's essential for us to become fully aware that the profound change implicated by innovation regards our way of seeing, observing, and of understanding phenomena, processes, objects, the things, which must become a systemic perspective. Innovating also implies the courage to destabilize something which, to all appearances, is permanently well-balanced, well-rooted, stable, regular, orderly, and in some ways ideal. Innovation invariably involves a crucial challenge, even there, which means leaving behind certainties, consolidated vision, and ritualized behavior, and above all, ridding ourselves of the idea that things should be done in a certain way because it has always worked till now. For the future, the best itineraries, consequently, will those pursuing interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. In other words, those best equipped to prepare people to inhabit, not manage, to inhabit the current future complexity. Those who will to be able to shape critical and elastical mind at every level. I like to call hybrid figures. Hybrid figures open to contamination among fields of knowledge and skills. Hybrid figures who must not be mistaken for the growing numbers of experts of everything, on everything, but are rather highly trained professional figures, who have mastered a systemic approach, who are capable, even from their fields of specialization, of considering and evaluating the complex and ambivalent dimension of reality, recognizing the connection and open architecture. In the hyperconnected and interconnected society, we must be careful to define and use a complexity approach, being careful to the real risk of the simple solution for complex problems. This is a problem not only for the politics, because all is interdependent, all is interconnected, and would be a terrible mistake continue to keep separate our knowledge, our skills, our strategy. It's not a technological problem, it's an anthropological problem. We must educate it to unpredictability and error, not to control. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And see you soon. I'll come back soon.
Thank you, Professor Dominici, for bringing to our attention the importance of global leadership in this so far troubled 21st century. Your perspective as an educator is invaluable to build our future approach in developing knowledge and skills. All the more, as a fellow educator, I support your idea of a new organizational management of the educational field as an open system, which would be more responsive and easily adaptable to changes and eventually crises, as was the case in the past months. Our fourth panelist is Paul Ladd, Director at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. Before taking up this position, he had been at the United Nations Development Programme, where he had most recently been the director of the team supporting consultation and technical inputs for the 2030 Development Agenda. Previously, he led UNDP's policy team on inclusive globalization, including trade, development, finance, and migration. From 28-29, he provided support to the Office of the United Nations Secretary General on the financial and economic crisis and engagement with G20. He also worked for the UK Department for International Development on African countries, and is also supporting gender balance by participating in the International Geneva Gender Champions program along with Mr. Møller. Welcome, Mr. Ladd. You now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I can see that we're quite short of time. I'm going to try to truncate what I wanted to mention. But very briefly, for those of you that don't know UNRIST, we are a research institute based within the United Nations system that focuses on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. Most of our staff are based in Geneva, but we have a new office that we opened earlier this year that focuses exclusively on research uptake for the SDGs, and that office is in Bonn. Since 2016, we've actually held 2 conferences in Geneva on research, policy, practice, uptake. And some of the issues that participants have already mentioned perennially come up in that conference. It's about language, it's about working on topics that policymakers in all countries are interested in. It's about aligning incentives to make sure that researchers are working on the right things and they can communicate in the right way, but also that policymakers can filter and use intelligently the research that they receive. And I think what I'd like to spend my 5 minutes on is concentrating on a very concrete initiative that I think addresses a couple of your questions. And it is about a process that we've initiated this year with partners in International Geneva that builds on these earlier processes and conferences on science policy, practice, uptake. And the initiative is called From Science to Practice, Research and Knowledge to Achieve the SDGs. You can find more information about it on UNRIS's website, but it's a collaboration with the Swiss FDFA, the Think Tank Hub, the Geneva Science Policy Interface, the SDG Lab that Michael set up, and SDSN in Switzerland. And it has an advisory group that also includes the Graduate Institute, SNIS, the UN, and various other organizations. Now, in a nutshell, it's an initiative to take forward the conversation on science, policy, practice, uptake, but also to orient that particularly and practically to the HLPF review process on the SDGs, which takes place every July in New York. Now, member states decide periodically which SDGs they would like to review at the HLPF. And what we've done this year is cluster those in systems so that we can bring multidisciplinary insights and different sorts of researchers to bring their evidence to bear on those constraints. Now, the 3 clusters that we've decided on are human well-being and capabilities, which of course is particularly important with COVID threatening past progress made over the next few years. The second one is on sustainable and just economies, and the third one is on food systems and nutrition patterns. And in those, we have also mainstreamed the very important goal of gender equality, and SDG 17 on partnerships. Now, we've invited research organizations of all types, particularly from International Geneva, but working with their international partners, to submit evidence on each of those themes, and evidence of all types, quantitative, qualitative, case studies, evaluations in different regions, countries, or localities. And we've given a 3-month period that runs up until the end of the year for organizations to submit that evidence. And then we intend to synthesize that and compare and contrast it with our best understanding of the frontier of knowledge in that cluster. Now, when organizations submit that evidence, we also invite them to reflect on the practice or specific circumstances related to science policy uptake on that topic. Then we're planning a range of discussion and outreach events from March to July in 2021 to present that information in Geneva and at the HLPF in New York. Now, the main event in Geneva that we plan and the HLPF in New York will also include training activities for policymakers that help them assess and filter that information. And those activities are courtesy of the Geneva Science Policy Interface. So in summary, it's an initiative that takes forward the discussion on how best to get research to solve practical problems related to the SDGs, and it builds on the conversation on science policy practice uptake. Secondly, it's an attempt to connect Geneva more thoroughly with the HLPF process and to bridge the divide between UN hubs in New York and Geneva. And thirdly, if successful, it's a process that I foresee could be held every year or perhaps every 2 years that can become a part of the fabric of the HLPF. In a way, Geneva's HLPF, the contribution to SDG implementation, building thoroughly on the skills, knowledge, and research that exists in international Geneva. Now, as I said, there are more details on our website, and if you'd like to be engaged, you can still submit evidence before the end of the year, or you can get in touch with me or my colleagues to find out more information on how to get engaged. Back to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Led, for laying the emphasis on the research dimension of the CSDG implementation. In order to build effective solutions, one needs to in-depth explore the issues that are the root of the problems, be it human well-being or state governance practices. However, research is not enough, and I'm glad to see that you have moved from research to the 3 working groups you mentioned, and that you have established a calendar for evaluating your results. I am sure I speak on behalf of us all when I say that we look forward to seeing your results next year when you intend to present them in Geneva. Last but not least, we welcome our 5th panelist, Dr. Peter Mcgrath, Executive Director of the InterAcademy Partnership, which has been, to my knowledge, a traditional partner of the World Academy of Art of Science in all its projects. Dr. Mcgrath has an academic and research career in the United Kingdom, followed by freelance journalism and the joining of the World Academy of Science in Trieste, Italy in 2003, initially in the Public Information Office. In November 2013, he took over as a coordinator of the InterAcademy Partnership, a global network of academies of science and medicine that work together to provide independent expert advice on scientific, technological, and health issues. Among his duties at IAP, he acts as secretary to the IAP Science Education Program's Global Council. Throughout his work, he also focused on gender issues, overseeing the activities of Organization for Women in Science, for the developing world. Welcome, Dr. Mcgrath. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. You've also introduced my organization, the InterAcademy Partnership. It's a global network of 143 merit-based academies, of which WAS, the World Academy of Art and Science, is one of the members. So we're very pleased to work with those, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this meeting. Let me start just by saying as an introduction that there are 3 levels of problems, of challenges that have been recognized, and that science is very good, science and technology, very good at answering challenges that can be classed as either simple, like, for example, catapulting a brick into the air, or complicated. We could even call that rocket science. We can combine Newton's laws with computerization and electronic engineering and so on, and we can send rockets to the moon, satellites into orbits. The third level of problem, however, is what we class as complex, often described as wicked problems. And this is where the issues like the global pandemic, climate change, biodiversity loss come in. The SDGs themselves, they are not problems or challenges that can be dealt with science and technology alone. They need economics, they need politics, they need the needs of different interest groups, the private sector and others, to be taken into account when finding workable solutions to these sort of wicked challenges. But having said that, the input of science and technology is essential. A speaker at one of our workshops here in Trieste in Italy some time ago said it very well. He said, policy making without science is just guessing. So I like this quote a lot. In fact, in the opening session of this conference, it was the former president of Latvia, Vaira Vaika-Freiberger, who argued that elected leaders had to rely on expert opinion, the trained minds that use the scientific method to develop new knowledge. And I just want to reiterate, there was a study published earlier this year by the Edelman Trust on credibility and trust. And 80% of their respondents said that they trusted scientists. If you compare this to other sectors, 51% trusted CEOs and only 42% trusted government leaders. So there is a strong level of trust out there in the public on the work and the knowledge of scientists. But science itself is not a perfect system. What we need, again, as Vaira Vaika-Freiberger said, is not to operate in silos, but she talked about a matrix of the needs and a matrix of ideas to be tested and implemented. So we're really cross-cutting philosophy and science. And I think some of the other speakers earlier have touched on this. And this is what IAP's philosophy is too. So whatever challenge we tackle, we aim to put together a committee of experts nominated by their member academies. And then in establishing the group, we take into account the diversity of the relevant scientific fields, including the social sciences. We look for regional representation, including balanced representation from low and middle income countries. And we look at gender. We also include the voice of a young scientist, usually someone from the Global Young Academy, which is also a member academy of IAP. But we know we can do better. Academies themselves are largely male dominated. A survey published in 2016 confirmed that as a global average, women accounted for just 12% of academy members. I'm pleased to say we've just completed a follow-up survey and the situation is improving. But we should also note the growing movement to establish national young academies. These are scientists, leading scientists aged 35 to 40 years. These national young academies are doing much better in this regard, and about 40% of their members, 40% or more, are typically women. And this inclusivity will be important as we move forward. There is also a coalition of science bodies led by the International Science Council that's now discussing how to combat discrimination in science. And this will have important ramifications also for inclusivity as we move forward. I then want to talk about pretty much what Piero Dominici has just said. We're pushing this idea of, it was called learning agility in an earlier session. So IAP has been promoting the idea of inquiry-based science education or learning by doing for some 20 years. And we know that by learning this way, children not only learn their science better, but they understand better how to question information and identifying misinformation, and learn how to work in teams, a way of eliminating silos. And a major US study has proved that learning this IPSI way also reduces inequalities between children from communities with different degrees of advantage and disadvantage. So I agree wholeheartedly with Piero Dominici and ask, why aren't all countries teaching science in this inquiry-based way? They should, and this is our future. And then I just one last thing about inequalities in science, if you like, is the North-South divide in knowledge production. A 2017 paper, for example, cited that 80% of authors and reviewers of IPCC reports were from OECD countries. Another metric, Africa accounts for only 0.8% of global R&D expenditure and produces just 2.4% of research publications. Many African nations have fewer than 100 PhD students per million population, many even fewer than 20. Compare this to the USA with 1,500 per million, or Korea with about 1,200 per million, and you can see the issues that are arising here. There is also countries in the South that are investing in science and technology, but there is a gap, a South-South gap being established, a growing gap, because some countries are just not investing in their universities, research centers, and trained personnel. So I ask, how can nations with such poor research infrastructure and a struggling scientific community, A, expect to get the best possible scientific input into their decision-making processes, and B, contribute in an equitable way to global discussions on issues that involve science, such as climate change, pandemic preparedness and response, and others, these wicked problems that I've discussed. Many organizations are trying to build the capacity in science in the South. And TWAS, the organization that hosts IAP here in Trieste, is one such organization. But it's imperative for governments and national leaders to commit to making that investment in science and technology. Doing so is a win-win situation. It'll result in better policies, better informed by and adapted to local conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, I've said that science is not a perfect enterprise, but as an academic enterprise, it is constantly re-examining itself and making improvements. The global movement to greater inclusivity, while slow, is a positive reflection that the scientific enterprise is adapting and changing for the better. But as I argued earlier, policy making without science is just guessing. Scientific input is necessary for tackling the complex and wicked issues facing humanity today. We owe it to future generations to include inclusive science at the heart of our decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mcgrath, for your ideas and for highlighting once again the importance of education in achieving development in the long term. Moreover, we need to focus more on reducing the inequalities between children, on the one hand, given the countries they come from, as you mentioned Africa several times, and between students, as all need to be involved on an equal footing in all aspects of science and education. Thank you all for the ideas you put together based on your extensive expertise that will undoubtedly serve as a good fundament for the approaches to research and policy making in the new future. The aim of this panel was to discuss the models that could be implemented at the national, regional, global level that can achieve the above mentioned goal, especially in the larger context of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development and the ensuing 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I support the idea of using models, but I would like to highlight that these models are simply offering guidelines in the resolution of events, but not the very solutions. That is why we must approach this model carefully in order not to rely too much on them and acknowledge their only limited usefulness. However, these models are precious as they represent an expression of the lesson learned so far, and it is up to us, the academic as well as the society, to implement the learning derived from it. In the end, I would like to bring to your attention the platform launched by the 11th Institute entitled "What Will the World Look Like After the Pandemic?" An online platform reuniting contributions on ideas and recommendations for worldwide scholars on various issues, including some of those mentioned, human rights, multilateralism, health, education, and so forth. All these contributions will be gathered in a volume to be published yearly in 2021. I would like to present to you Dr. Juana Brenda, who has been the project manager of the platform and will be in charge with collating the contribution in a volume together with me. We invite all of you to visit the online platform of the Institute website, and we look forward to receiving your valuable contribution. I thank you all again for today's discussion, and I look forward to seeing you again in future events. Goodbye.